All right, so possibly our last test is going to be on viruses, bacteria, and a little ecology. The virus stuff and the bacteria stuff we've already talked mostly about, but just a quick review. The word virus means poison. Viruses are not considered to be alive. They don't have cells. There's viruses all in this room right now, and they're pretty much just floating around, laying around, doing absolutely nothing. And they don't do anything until what happens?
They attach to like cells.
Yeah, not even attach until they actually do what? Get in, okay? And what part gets in? Their genetic material, DNA or RNA. Remember, they're called obligate intracellular parasites. They have to be inside a cell, and when they get in, they cause damage. Bacteriophages are maybe the most simple kind of virus. They're viruses that attack bacteria. And remember that all our viruses are essentially made out of two parts. In this picture, the blue part is what's called the capsid. It's like a coating of protein. And then inside that is some kind of genetic material. It's either DNA or RNA, not both. It's one or the other. In addition to that, some viruses have what's called an envelope on the outside, kind of a coating on top of their protein coat.
Can it have both a capsid and envelope?
Yes. Like, for example, the light blue in this picture, that's the capsid, and then the purple thing on the outside is the envelope. So you can have both. We spent a lot of time talking about the lytic cycle. That's the life cycle of a virus. It's how it works, it's how it reproduces. Remember, first it has to attach to some kind of receptor on the outside of a cell. Then the virus injects its genetic material, which will go in and take over the cell essentially. And the cell basically becomes a virus factory. It starts doing biosynthesis. It starts making pieces of viruses. Eventually it does maturation where it puts those pieces together. And then why it's called the lytic cycle is that when it's finished, it's made so many viruses that in most cases, those viruses just explode the cell and come out and go to infect lots of other cells. That's the lytic cycle. Lytic means to cut, split, break, tear. There are a few viruses that go through what's called the lysogenic cycle, which means they inject their DNA, but then it becomes part of the host DNA. And for a long time, there may not be any symptoms at all. But when something weird goes on with that organism, something causes its immune response to weaken, maybe cancer, maybe some other infection, maybe stress, that virus will go out of the lysogenic cycle and go back up into the lytic cycle, and it'll start causing symptoms again. A good example of a virus that is the chickenpox / what virus?
Shingles.
Shingles. Can go back and forth between the two. And remember that with viruses, right now there aren't a lot of good treatments for most viral diseases.
Because they change.
Yeah, antibiotics don't work. It's essentially wait on your immune system to kill it. Now remember, we are working on some antiviral disease treatments. Like with Ebola, they have several things that they're using to treat certain viruses.
You said like Tamiflu?
Tamiflu would be an example with the flu. There's all kinds of drugs to treat HIV. But in most cases, virus infections, the doctor's going to tell you to go home, can't really help you, here's something to treat your symptoms, but to fight off the infection, you've got to do it. One other thing I'll mention, remember there's two main kinds of viruses, DNA-based, RNA-based. And which ones are the hardest for us to control? RNA ones, because RNA is more likely to what? Mutate. And it's harder for us to make a vaccine to control it because it's always changing. And the vaccine you made yesterday may not work tomorrow because that virus has changed. All right, remember, a pathogen is anything that makes us sick. An epidemic is a local outbreak of disease. And a pandemic is worldwide, like the 1918 flu we talked about, or maybe like the AIDS pandemic. All those are pandemics.
Ebola is like an epidemic.
Ebola is more of an epidemic right now. It's isolated mostly to northwestern part of Africa. All right, then we talked about bacteria, particularly eubacteria, the regular true bacteria. And we said the bacteria are prokaryotic. We all know what that means, I hope. They lack a membrane-bound nucleus. They don't have all those little organelles that most cells have. They're single cells. They have a cell wall. It's made of a special material kind of unique to bacteria called peptidoglycan. They have ribosomes. They have to, because ribosomes do what? Make proteins. That's essential. They have DNA. Usually it's just a single circular chromosome floating around where? In the cytoplasm. It's not enclosed. Most of the time they reproduce through prokaryotic, or what we call what? Binary fission, asexually. We said that's not always good because it doesn't create any what? Diversity, variation. So they have a method where the two bacteria can attach together. It's called conjugation. And when they conjugate, what do they swap? What do they switch between the two?
Genetic material.
Yeah, what are the little pieces of DNA that they can switch called?
Chromatids.
They're called plasmids. Got these little extra pieces of DNA separate from their main chromosome called plasmids that they can switch. That's important because that allows them to get some genetic diversity. We said that's kind of unlucky for us because what kinds of genes do they often transfer? Ones that make them sometimes what? Immune to antibiotics. And that makes it harder for us to treat them. We talked about the different shapes of bacteria, how that ones that are shaped like a ball, a sphere, are called coccus. The ones that are shaped like a medicine capsule, or what you might call a rod, those are called, what are the rod shaped ones called? Starts with a B. Maybe I need to put that one up here. They're called a bacillus. Bacillus. And then we also have some that are kind of corkscrew shaped, and those are called spirillum. Remember that there are lots of bacterial diseases, including things like strep, tetanus, a lot of the STDs like syphilis and chlamydia, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and lots of others. The bubonic plague, for example, was bacterial as well. The nice thing about most of those is they're treatable with antibiotics. Antibiotics are used to treat bacterial infections, not virus infections. So you can typically get over this. Now there are a few bacterial diseases that have become resistant to most of our antibiotics, like certain kinds of staph infections, like certain kinds of tuberculosis, and that's kind of scary. But even though we talk about all these diseases when we talk about bacteria, remember that most of them are good. Most of them are positive. Their main role is decomposition. And when they decompose things, what do they help us to recycle?
Nitrogen plus carbon dioxide.
All kinds of what? Nutrients, yeah. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen,
Oxygen, phosphorus.
all the different elements that we need, they help us to recycle them. They're also involved in nitrogen fixation, which is taking nitrogen out of the air
Putting it in soil.
and then making it into a form that most things can use and putting it into the soil or into the water. And a lot of that happens where? Where do these bacteria live that do nitrogen fixation?
Wet environment.
Some just live in the water, some just live in the soil, but the most famous ones live where?
The air.
On the roots of certain kinds of plants.
Yeah.
Like soybeans, for example, bean plants. And in return for providing that plant with nitrogen, what does the plant give to the bacteria? What do plants have plenty of? It's a plant. What can it do that you can't, or that most bacteria can't? Photosynthesis. So it sends it some sugar. So it's a trade-off. You give me nitrogen, I give you sugar. And it works. It works for both. So bacteria, even though they do cause some diseases, by far they're better. They do more good things than they do bad things. Let's put it that way. Remember, they're numerous. There are more bacteria living on or in you right now than there are people on Earth. There are more bacterial cells on or in you than there are your own cells. So they are everywhere. And most of them are good. There's a typical bacteria. It may have flagella to help it move. It may have a plasmid, extra pieces of DNA that it can swap during conjugation. It's always going to have this one big chromosome in the middle. You see all these little dots? Those are ribosomes that help it make proteins.
Is that
All-
ciliary?
No, those are something else. We'll get to that. They also have a cell membrane, like all cells. Remember, they have cell wall. And what Mr. Childers there was asking about were these little hair-like things. These are called pili, P-I-L-I. And those things can do a couple things. Some of them help the bacteria to conjugate, and help them to attach to each other and transfer genetic material. Some of them you might think of kind of like Velcro. They help them to attach to surfaces and stick there so they don't get washed away or something. That's your typical eubacteria. There's some bacteria in the different shapes. The one on the left is a spirillum, kind of spiral shaped. One in the middle is a bacillus, kind of rod or capsule shaped. And then right here we have a string, a chain of spheres. That's called streptococcus. It's like strep throat bacteria. Here's some cyanobacteria. And remember, these are the bacteria that can do what? Photosynthesis. Most can't. This is the kind of bacteria that can do photosynthesis. Some scientists think these are very much like probably the first living things on Earth. All right, and then the other group that we need to mention briefly here, archaea. Now that word means what? Archaea. Really old, ancient. And a lot of scientists at first thought these things might be very similar to the first living things. There's some debate about that now. When they first found these bacteria, where did they find them? What they call extreme environments. Places that were really, really hot or really, really wet. Yeah, 80. Really, really salty, really, really acidic. So at first they called them extremophiles, which meant they love extreme environments. But after they started looking a little bit more closely, where did they find them? In normal places, like inside your intestines. Just in normal places. So they're not just living in extreme places, they also live in normal places. They're a lot like bacteria, regular bacteria. They're prokaryotic, single cell things. But when, no, they don't cause any damage to people, they don't make people sick. But when they started looking at their DNA and their RNA and their proteins, they found that a lot of their genes were more like eukaryotic genes than they were like what? Bacteria, regular bacteria. So if you look at a lot of phylogenetic trees now, they're sort of drawn in the middle between the bacteria and the eukaryotes, which means there's sort of a common ancestor between us, the eukaryotes, and the other prokaryotes, the bacteria. But some of them are called methanogens. What's methane?
So naturally.
What kind of gas? It's natural gas. It's the stuff that a lot of you run your water heater at home on, maybe your stove. You may run your heater. It also is the gas that you produce when you have gas. Sometimes it comes out of swamps.
Wait, so does it?
No, slow down.
That's the fecal
The gases that you make. The methane has no smell. That's why if you have methane run into your house, and if you were to turn it on, it does smell at your house because they add something to it to make it smell. Why would you want to add something to it to make it smell?
So you smell it.
So if you had a leak,
Smell it.
you wouldn't want it to explode and you not to know it was there. So they add this sulfur-based chemical, which is the same kind of thing that happens when it's being made in you. Because you also, in addition to giving off methane, you give off these other gases that have sulfury like smells, and that's why that stuff stinks. But it's not the methane. Methane can be used to run cars. And there are a lot of people in this country who want to start running our cars off of it because we have a lot of methane, maybe more than any place in the world. And we don't do a really good job of using it right now. And there's a lot of people that want to power more and more things with natural gas. Might happen soon. Saw a thing yesterday on the news where I think it was Chevron, the oil company, just hit this big, huge oil and natural gas well in the Gulf of Mexico. It's not leaking. It's not leaking. They just drilled it, and it's putting out huge amounts of natural gas, huge amounts of oil and gas, and that's a good thing, I think, for us. Some archaea are also called thermoacidophiles, which means they like heat and acid. Some are called halophiles, which means they like salt. Halo means salt. So even though they're found in extreme places, remember that they're also found in normal places. They're very similar to regular eubacteria, but what's different is that some of their genes, some of their proteins seem to be more like ours, like the eukaryotes, than they are the other bacteria. All right, and now I want to switch over to something different, something we haven't talked about, something you might want to write down because this is all new. So get out a sheet of paper and let's do this. All right, while you guys are doing that, recording right now. Let's keep going. So we're going to do a very abbreviated discussion of ecology. And I need everybody to focus on it. Ecology is how organisms interact with what? With each other and with their environment. How organisms interact with each other and with their environment. That's ecology. Big part of biology. We're just completely running out of time in this course, though. We're not going to spend a big amount of time on it. But it's how do organisms interact with each other and with their environment. Everybody in here has seen a food chain before. You've seen those in regular biology. That's part of ecology. For example, in a food chain, down at the bottom, down at the bottom of a food chain, you might have, for example, a plant. So let's start with a plant. The arrow typically points to the thing that's eating the other thing. Doing a food chain. So we got a plant. Maybe that plant is eaten by a ladybug.
Ladybugs don't eat plants.
All right, and then maybe that ladybug, let's say, is eaten by a lizard. And then let's say that lizard is eaten by a hawk. So that's a simple food chain. Now, that's a simple way of looking at what eats what. But in reality, is it that simple?
No.
No. Because is the lizard the only thing that eats a ladybug? Probably. Probably not. Is the hawk the only thing that eats the lizard? Probably not. So in the real world, we think of it more as what we call a food web. And let's put a picture of a food web up here real quick. Here's maybe more what it looks like. This one's oversimplified too. Remember that the arrows are pointing toward the thing that's doing the eating. So we always want to start at the bottom of our food chain. The kinds of things at the bottom are always going to be what we call the producers, right? The things that can do what? Photosynthesis. So in this picture, the only thing in this picture that can do photosynthesis are these guys. Plankton, algae kinds of things. Now if you look at it, what kinds of things in this diagram eat phytoplankton? All right, the trout, the dragonfly, and the mayfly, all three of those eat the plankton. So we might call those primary what? Consumers. Things that eat producers are called consumers. So these are the first consumers. We're going to call those the primary consumers. Then we go a step ahead. Let's take the mayfly, for example. What eats the mayfly? The frog and the salamander. and the trout. So in that context,
Wait, how does it eat the
the trout eats a lot of stuff. See this arrow? So if we think of it like a food chain, the mayfly or those things, the frog, the trout, and what was the salamander could be what we call secondary consumers because they're eating a primary consumer.
In the tertiary.
Then if we look at the frog gets eaten, it looks like only by what?
Snake.
The snake. So it could be, we go primary, secondary to what? What means third? Listen, tertiary means third. So that's a tertiary consumer. And I'll put that word back up on another place in a minute. The salamander. He gets eaten by the snake, but also by the eagle. The trout gets eaten by the eagle, also by the person. So that's more what it looks like in the real world. Food web instead of food chain. And remember, the arrowheads point to the thing that's doing the eating. Something else we want to talk about is this guy. And this may be the most important thing that we're going to mention here right now. This is what we call an energy or a trophic pyramid. Energy pyramid or a trophic pyramid. All right, now here's the important thing. First of all, down at the bottom, always at the bottom, you're going to have something that's a producer. And remember, producers are called producers because they produce what? What do producers produce? Sugar. That's why they have to be at the bottom. They're usually autotrophs, things that can do photosynthesis. The things that eat them, in this case the grasshopper, this guy is called a primary consumer. The thing that eats the grasshopper, the thing that eats the primary consumer is a secondary consumer. The thing that eats the secondary consumer is called a tertiary consumer. And then the one that eats the tertiary consumer, you might hear it called the fourth level consumer, but we're going to call it a quaternary. Quarter like a fork, right? 4 quarters in a dollar kind of thing. Quaternary consumer. And we could go further. And it's the fourth consumer. It's the fourth consumer.
What's the third one?
Tertiary.
No.
Secondary. So we got producers at the bottom. Primary consumers eat the producers. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. And quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers. Now, let's talk about the shape of this pyramid for a second. It obviously is wider at the bottom and smaller at the top. There's a reason for that. Here's the thing. If you look at these numbers out beside each name, they're in, what's KCAL stand for? Kilocalories. What do calories measure? Energy. So if you look, it says the grass, and these are made up numbers, by the way, but the pattern is what we want to look at here. The grass has 10,000 kilocalories of energy. Where did the grass get that energy from? The sun. But if you look, the grasshoppers only get 1,000 kilocalories. Let's say those grasshoppers ate all that grass. Where'd the other 9,000 kilocalories of energy go?
The air. To the frog.
When you eat food, do you get all the energy out of that food that you ate?
No.
No. Some of it you use to make ATP. That's what counts, right? The part you can actually use. A lot of the energy that was in that food comes out of your body as what? What kind of waste?
Sweat.
Right. Heat, first of all. Let's think about heat first. Whenever you do cell respiration on something, you release some heat. Is that heat helping you a whole lot? Well, it may help you to maintain your body temperature, so that's important. But once it comes out as heat, can anything else really use that energy anymore? No. It's still there, but it's not really usable, and it ultimately ends up where? On past that. After it's in the air, where does it eventually end up? In space. Nothing's going to be able to get it again. All right, some of that energy that was in that food you ate, you can't really digest, so it does come out in your waste, for lack of a better word. Okay? So here's the rule, and this is an important rule. It's called the rule of 10. The rule of 10. And essentially what it says is that as you go up the food chain, only about 10% of the energy in one level is transmitted to the next level up. If you notice, 10,000 here, 1,000 here, only about 10% made it. The other 90% is lost as what? Some kind of waste. It doesn't make it up. But that energy's still there. It's just that the grasshoppers in this can't get to it. Either they give it off as heat, or it comes out in their waste. One or the other. What's 10% of 1,000?
100.
100. Only 10% of the energy from the grasshopper make it to the frog. What's 10% of 100?
10.
10. Only 10% of the energy that the frogs had made it to the snakes. 10% of 10 is 1, right?
So do we not get a lot of energy?
Do I know?
Do we not get as much energy?
Well, that's the idea. The reason it's a pyramid shape is 2 reasons. As you go up the food chain, number 1, there's less and less what? Energy that's available. And because there's less and less energy that's available, there can also be less and less what? Of that thing. Think about how many hawks you've seen around here. Not that many. There can't be that many hawks around here because there's not enough what? There's not enough snakes, and there's not enough snakes because there's not enough frogs. There's not. Where I'm going is that as you go up as you go up this pyramid, there's less and less numbers of these things, mainly because there's less and less what? Energy. It's all about energy.
There's a lot of people there.
Well, there are. And the reason there can be a lot of people is because we don't just belong to one food chain, right? We figured out how to make our own food and therefore have essentially an unlimited amount of energy. We sort of beat biology by doing that. Semantic. But here's the thing. This again is called an energy or a trophic pyramid. The word trophic means feeding. It's a feeding pyramid. It has to do with how energy is transmitted up the chain. Because there's less and less energy available at each level up, there can be less and less organisms. Food or energy pyramid. And then one other thing we want to talk about, and then we'll take a break and we'll do our little lab activity, are what are called biogeochemical cycles. That sounds complicated. Biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical. What's bio mean? You're in biology. I hope you know what bio means. It means life. What's geo mean?
Geological.
Earth, and then chemicals. A biogeochemical cycle is how living things cycle certain materials from the earth over and over again. For example, let's take carbon. How does the amount of carbon on Earth today compare to the amount of carbon that was on Earth in the beginning? It's about the same. And that carbon has just been used over and over and over. It's been recycled. The same can be said of nitrogen or phosphorus, maybe even water. Those materials get used over and over again. That's what a biogeochemical cycle is. How do certain minerals, how do certain materials on Earth get cycled over and over again by living things? Pretty simple idea. There's 3 cycles I want you to know a little bit about. The water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. Keep in mind that those are not the only three biogeochemical cycles. Those are the only three we're going to be concerned with in this class. Water, carbon, nitrogen. Let's look first at a little diagram here of the water cycle. You've probably been seeing this since second grade, the water cycle. And you all know something about it. All right, let's start off this way. The water cycle, we can think of it starting. Now it's a cycle, it's a circle, so there's really no start and no end. But let's think of it starting from water evaporating from the oceans, from a lake, from a stream. And as water evaporates, it rises. And as it rises, what happens to it? Yeah, but it gets, what happens to the temperature as it goes up? It gets colder, right? And as water vapor gets colder, what happens to it? It turns back into liquid water, right? That happens in the clouds. We call that condensation. Now, there's also something happening in the plants. You might not know it, but on the bottoms of the leaves of plants are little holes, right? They're called stomates. And they're sort of like your nostrils. Because plants, remember, have to breathe. They need to breathe in what gas? CO2. And they need to breathe out what gas? Oxygen. But as they're breathing out that oxygen, what else is coming out those holes? Water. And that's called transpiration. So plants put a lot of water back up in the sky. That condenses, and eventually you get precipitation. Whether it's rain, or snow, or sleet, or hail, or whatever it might be, that's precipitation, water coming back down. Now, some of that water will sink into the ground. And you may not know it, but underneath the ground, there are like lakes under the ground, way deep. And then if you go even deeper, there's like rivers of water under the ground, depending on where you're at. And that's how you get a well, right? Most wells, you dig down to like an underground lake. If that's the well you drilled, what do you have to do to get the water out? You have to pump it. Most people's well, that's how it works. You have to have a pump that pumps the water up from the ground. Then you use a bucket, right? But you had to use the energy to get the water up. Now, if you drill all the way down to one of those underwater rivers, though, that water's moving. What might happen if you drill down to one of those? You don't need anything. The water shoots up. And what do we call those kinds of wells? Yeah, we might call it a spring. Okay? A spring is essentially a hole that goes down to that underwater river, and the water comes up through it. Sometimes it's called an artesian well. But those can be natural, or they can be man-made, depending on the case. A lot of that precipitation obviously runs off, and it ends up in an ocean or in a river or in a stream. We've made the issue of runoff a bigger deal than it ought to be by doing what? Building cities and putting what everywhere? Concrete, right? Because when the water comes down, it can't sink into the ground like it's supposed to in a lot of cases. It ends up on concrete, and it goes places where it's not supposed to go because that's an issue. Another way that we cause some problems with the water cycle is we cut down a lot of trees, right? And therefore there's less what? Less transpiration. For example, down in places like South America, where there are a lot of rainforests. As people cut down those rainforests, what happens to that land in some cases that used to be rainforest? Sometimes it becomes almost like a desert. Because the water that the plants were pulling out of the ground and putting into the sky, when the trees aren't there, where does that water stay? In the ground. It stays in the ground, which means what doesn't happen there anymore? It doesn't rain much. So what used to be a rainforest, and it was raining every day almost, maybe off and on all day long, now there's very little rain because they cut the trees down, and the water that was being cycled by those trees is now staying in the ground. So that's one of the reasons we don't want to cut down rainforests. It can cause changes in the climate pattern, changes in rain patterns all over the place. Same with putting concrete everywhere. You can change weather patterns. That's the weather cycle, the water cycle rather. Let's talk now about the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle, there's two main processes in the carbon cycle. And those are photosynthesis and what? What's kind of the opposite of photosynthesis? Cell respiration. What's photosynthesis doing with carbon? Where does it get carbon from, photosynthesis? Where does the carbon that photosynthesis needs come from? Where do plants get their carbon? God, think. Plants get their carbon from where? Carbon dioxide. They get it from the air. They breathe it in through those little stomates. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the air and uses it to make what we call organic materials like sugar. That's what photosynthesis does to carbon. Now on the other hand, cell respiration takes those sugars in, burns them essentially, and then releases what? What does cell respiration give off? Carbon dioxide, that goes back into the air. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide in, cell respiration puts it back out. It's a cycle. Over and over and over and over and over again. Been going on Earth since life began. All living things have to eat. So they all take in carbon, sugars or proteins or something, fats. They do cell respiration on them. They burn them, put carbon dioxide back into the air. Now, us as humans have messed with this cycle in several ways. We like to burn things. Whether we're burning coal or gas or wood or James, okay? It doesn't matter, okay? When you burn things, when you burn carbon-containing things, what three things are always given off when you burn something? A carbon-containing thing. When you combust a carbon-containing thing, you get carbon dioxide, you get water vapor, and you get some kind of energy, whether it be heat, light, or maybe ATP. All those things are given off. So here's the thing. As humans have burned more and more stuff, as we've used more and more cars, as we've had more and more electrical factories, we've been putting more and more CO2 into the air, right? And according to at least some scientists, and there's debate about this, what does that extra CO2 maybe cause?
Global warming.
Some people would argue that it causes the Earth to get warmer. Others would say it has no effect. I'm not going to go there because I think that's more of a political issue than a science issue. But here's the thing. Yeah.
What causes acid rain?
Acid rain's completely different deal. Give me a little while, we'll get to that. This has nothing to do with acid rain. Here's the thing. There is no doubt, regardless of what you think about global warming, that by burning more stuff, either gas in our cars or coal in our power plants, that we have increased the amount of CO2 in the air. Now, what's a plant thinking if there's more CO2 in the air? Plant thinking yay or bad? Plant's thinking yay, right? Because more CO2 for a plant in the air would mean it's easier for it to do what? Photosynthesis, and easier to breathe. So there's some good and bad. Now, there's several other issues that might go on. The CO2, maybe it causes the temperature to change. In the oceans, some of that CO2 is dissolving into the oceans. And plants in the water use it. But something else I want you to think about. If we were just to take some water and bubble into it some carbon dioxide, anybody know what would happen if you took water and you bubbled, you just blew some carbon dioxide into that water?
Make it acidic.
It makes it acidic. It makes this stuff called carbonic acid. It's the same stuff that's in like Coca-Cola. That's what makes Coke acidic. They bubble CO2 into it. That's called carbonated water. But some people worry that as there's more and more CO2 in the air, that more and more of that CO2 is going to dissolve into the oceans and essentially cause the oceans to become what? Acidic. And that would be bad. And there's a big deal made about cutting down rainforests. And I'm not saying we should cut down rainforests, we shouldn't. But a lot of people say that if you cut down the rainforest, what's going to happen? We're gonna die because there won't be enough what? Oxygen. Those people are lying to you, right?
Bacteria.
Most of the oxygen on Earth doesn't come from plants. Where does it come from?
I mean bacteria.
Little bacteria and protists living in the oceans. That's where most photosynthesis happens. Because most of the world is not covered by land. Most of the world's covered by water, right? So when it becomes really dangerous, it's when we kill the oceans. And hopefully, that's not happening. Hopefully, we're not making the oceans acidic, because that would be really bad. But that's the carbon cycle. Essentially made of photosynthesis, taking carbon dioxide in, using it to make organic sugars. Cell respiration, taking that sugar, breaking it down to get energy, releasing CO2 back. And remember, we mess with that cycle by burning things and creating some extra CO2. And then the last cycle I will mention is nitrogen. There's a lot of nitrogen on Earth, but the problem is most of it is where? It's in the air. And it's in this molecule that we call atmospheric nitrogen, or N2. And the bad thing about N2 is that those two nitrogens are held together by 3 bonds. It's called a triple bond. And that means it's really hard to do what? It's hard to split it. It's hard to separate it. And the thing is, if you can't separate it, you can't use it. So even though there's a lot of nitrogen on Earth, there's not a lot of nitrogen that things can actually use on Earth. It's trapped in this gas, nitrogen gas. Now, there's a few things that can use that gas. And they can take that gas in, and they can do what's called nitrogen fixation. Important point, nitrogen fixation. It's taking this stuff into and turning it into a form that's useful for living things, that's usable for things. And usually, it's either this or this that things can use. Ammonia, or ammonium, or nitrate. If you've ever been to like Home Depot or Lowe's and you bought a bag of fertilizer, a lot of bags of fertilizer, what do they say on the label? What's in there?
Nitrogen rich.
A lot of them say ammonium nitrate. That's what most fertilizers are. Some form of that. Because the reason for putting fertilizer on the soil is to increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil, the amount of nitrogen that's usable for the plants. Most of the things that can take this out of the air and turn it into either ammonium or nitrate are bacteria in most cases. Some of those bacteria just live in the soil on their own. Some live in the ocean, just kind of floating around in the oceans. But like we said a minute ago, a lot of them live on the roots of certain plants. Usually bean plants, what we call legumes, like soybeans, maybe peanuts. And those plants take in that nitrogen out of the air, the N2, and convert it into either this or this, ammonium or nitrate. And that makes it usable for plants and animals. On the other hand, there are bacteria in the soil that do the opposite. They take the ammonium and the nitrate and convert it back into what? N2. And that's the nitrogen cycle. Over and over. And maybe one of the most important discoveries ever made for our existence as humans is that somebody figured out how to do this in a lab. They can take in this nitrogen and make ammonium or nitrate. And that's how we figured out how to create fertilizers. And that increased the amount of crops we could grow, it increased the amount of food that we have, and it made life possible for 6 or 7 billion people, however many of us there are. Without that, it'd be a lot harder to grow our food, and we'd still be using like cow manure and stuff like that for fertilizer. And, this makes life a better place. Now, one bad side effect of us doing that is when we put all this nitrogen on our fields, where does a lot of that fertilizer end up?
In our water.
In the rain.
It ends up in the rain, which ends up where? It ends up in bodies of water, either in rivers or lakes or ponds or maybe the ocean. And that can cause problems. If you've ever been in a cow pasture before, there's usually a pond in the middle of the cow pasture, right? And what does that pond usually look like? It's usually like gooey green. It's like a green soup. Sometimes it may be red. Different algae grow in it though that wouldn't normally be growing there. Why are all these things growing in that pond in the cow pasture? Because there's a lot of nitrogen. Normally, is there very much nitrogen in water? Nope. Well, maybe. But here's the thing. Normally, there's not a lot of nitrogen in the water, so therefore there can't be too many algae, plankton, those kinds of things. But all of a sudden, we put this extra nitrogen in the water by accident. So we put it on the field and it washed into the water, and it caused that extra stuff to grow. If you've ever been like canoeing down the Flint River, how many of you have done that before?
We went kayaking.
That's how you got those plants gone through.
When you get near the big subdivisions, like Mount Carmel, for instance, or
Yeah, but
any of the ones right along the river, if you pay attention to the water near those subdivisions, what do you notice in the water near those subdivisions? You notice a lot of plants growing there.
I believe sewer lines and see others underwater.
Here's the reason why. In the county, after you go to the bathroom, ultimately, where does that end up?
In the water.
We don't have sewers in the county.
In the water.
It ends up ultimately in your backyard somewhere. You have this big concrete box under the ground, septic tank. You flush the toilet, it goes to this big concrete box, but that concrete box has holes in it and pipes that lead out of those holes. So every time you flush the toilet, that stuff goes into the septic tank and then it gets pushed out into the ground, and then eventually, if you're living in a subdivision like Mount Carmel, right on the river, some of that poop ends up in the river. Okay? It gets filtered through. Now it's not as nasty as it sounds, because all that dirt that it has to travel through acts like what? It acts like a filter, and that's the idea. But still, so a lot of that liquid. Slow down the focus for me here, guys. A lot of that liquid that came out of your toilet eventually ends up in the water. And what's in that liquid?
Nitrogen.
A lot of nitrogen. Your wastes are heavy in nitrogen. And because there's a lot of nitrogen, a lot of plants grow near those subdivisions because there's a lot of nitrogen there to help them to grow. Yeah.
Does that mean the creek behind my house is basically a sewer?
Well, I wouldn't go there because, like I said, the ground filters most of the bad stuff out. But some of that nitrogen makes it into that water.
That's really gross.
And it's going to have things growing. That's the nitrogen cycle. And remember that these three cycles that we just talked about, the water, the carbon, and the nitrogen cycles, we call those three things bio, geo, chemical cycles. And I want to mention one other thing. I'll get your question in a second, George. One other thing related to ecology, because we don't have much time to deal with ecology in here. Let me get to a slide where I can write a little bit. Let me just put in a new slide real quick. All right, here we go. All right, here we go. We talked a minute ago about those bacteria that live on tree roots, like, well, maybe soybean plants, and how they help it do the nitrogen cycle. That's an example of what we call a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic relationship. You guys have heard of that before. Focus. Symbiotic means that you've got things that are living, working together. Like the bacteria living on the soybean roots. And I'll come to some more examples in a second. But it's a relationship in biology where you have two or more things that are either living on or in each other. And they're working together in some way. Maybe good, maybe bad. There's three kinds of symbiotic relationships that we're going to talk about in this class. And the first one is called mutualism. A symbiotic relationship is where you have two or more living things that are living, working together. And the first type of symbiotic relationship we're going to talk about is mutualism. What's it mean if I said that Reed and I have a mutual understanding? What does that mean?
It means y'all understand each other in the same way.
Yeah, we have this shared agreement. Okay, we're working together. Mutual means both. Both. We both understand. If a symbiotic relationship is mutualism, it's a relationship that helps out both partners. It's good for both. The example that I just gave you of soybeans and bacteria, that's an example of mutualism. We said that the bacteria help to provide nitrogen, and in return, what do the soybeans give them? Sugar. So, okay. Another example is termites. Let's talk about termites for a second. We all know termites eat wood. But I'm going to tell you that termites can't digest wood. The little insect, the termite, can't digest wood. But living inside its gut is what? A little protozoan, a little one-celled eukaryote that digests it for it. Without that protist, the termite dies. And turns out, without the termite, the protist dies. Because the termite provides a home. It provides the wood. It's a good deal for both of them. That's mutualism. One can't live without the other. That's an example of mutualism. Now, the second one we're going to talk about is called parasitism. And we mentioned this earlier today. In parasitism, one of the partners benefits and the other one is hurt. One benefits, one hurt. Example, that would be a tick and you. Parasitism, the tick. And a human. The tick benefits when it gets on you. It gets blood, it gets food. On the other hand, you're losing blood, and maybe also you're getting what? You may get some kind of disease. Other examples. Maybe one of the grossest examples is all these worm infections you can get. Tapeworm. Let's talk about tapeworms for a second. You get a tapeworm by eating meat, usually that's undercooked.
Steak.
Could be steak. Actually, in the world, the most easy way to get a tapeworm, most common way, is from sushi. Undercooked meat of any kind. Here's the thing. Listen, if something has a tapeworm, just don't commentary. Just listen. Something has a tapeworm. Most of the worms live in the intestines of it. And essentially, what's going on in your small intestine?
It breaks down everything.
Where digestion happens, most of it, and where the nutrients get absorbed into your bloodstream. So this tapeworm is living in your intestine like a sponge. It lets you do all the digestion, and then before you absorb this digested stuff into your blood, it absorbs the blood stuff. And it's just stealing from you. Just stealing from you. Now, here's the thing. The whole time it's in you, though, it's reproducing. And some of the babies you poop out as eggs. And that's how a doctor knows if you have a tapeworm. Now, this is a dream job for maybe Michael here. So, some people's job in a lab is to take what they call fecal samples.
No.
You have to poop in a cup, essentially. And so they send that to the lab. And it's the job of some people at the lab to take that and put it under a microscope and look at the poop. And they're looking for little worm eggs and such. So Michael, that sound like a dream career for you?
It sounds like a
Who's investigator?
smell the spaghetti.
Hold on, Michael. I don't know. But it's dream job, yes.
What?
This sounds like it's been a
All right, we're not going any further with this discussion. Just this way. Go finish right now. All right. So here's the thing. Tapeworms, most of them in your intestines, like I said, they reproduce, their eggs come out the other side. But tapeworms can be dangerous because some of those babies hatch out inside you. And they can go through your bloodstream and get into your brain. And they can start feeding on your brain, which can ultimately kill you. Some of the babies will burrow up into your muscles and make things like encysted knots, essentially. Those can cause cramps and stuff, but those are not a big issue for you. But if say instead of this happening, it's happening in a cow instead of a person, those cysts are in the muscles. What part of the cow do we tend to eat? The muscles. And when you eat those cysts, if you don't cook the meat good, when you eat those cysts, those things hatch out inside you. That's how you get a tapeworm. Now, you got nothing to worry about if you cook the meat well done, because it kills the worm, and you're not going to get it. But if you eat, particularly, like I said, sushi, any kind of meat that's not well done, you can get worm infections. Hold on just a second. So that's parasitism. One partner benefits, the other one's harmed. The third and last form of symbiotic relationship we'll talk about is called commensalism. And this is where one of the partners benefits and the other one is not affected good or bad. One benefits and the other one's not affected good or bad. For example, you've got all these bacteria living on your skin. More bacteria living on your skin than there are people on Earth. Those bacteria aren't really helping you. They're not really hurting you. But they're getting a free meal because what's peeling off of you all the time? Dead skin cells, and they're feeding on those. Something else that's kind of gross and it's going to make you itch all day long. And I want you to Google this when you get home.
I do not want to Google.
There are living in your eyelashes these things called eyelash mites. Okay. Listen. I want you to Google it when you get home. These little eyelash mites feed on skin. They feed on secretions from your eyes. They feed on makeup, lace. And they look. If you were to blow it up with a microscope, they look like some scary monster worm. Okay? I want you to Google this when you get home. Here's the thing. They don't hurt you. They don't help you. But you're providing for them a free home. You're providing for them free food. Good for them. Not helping. Not hurting you. So, once again, symbiotic relationships are relationships where two or more things are living or working together. They can be mutualistic, which means both of the partners benefit. They can be parasitic, where one partner benefits and the other one's hurt. Or they can be commensalism kinds of relationships. One of the partners benefits and the other one's not affected in a good way or a bad way. The commensalism?
What about where
Like the bacteria living on your skin or those mites living in your eyelashes. Either one of those would be good examples.
don't want